Glen Peters, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Thank you. It's great to join you.
Nice. Are we heading towards the climate Armageddon?
No, I guess that depends a little bit on your definition and who you are. If you look at individual groups and individual countries, for them, it may well be Armageddon. If you're a small island state and sea level rise consumes your country, then yes, it's Armageddon, I guess. For other countries, it'll be, or other um, and it all depends on where the world heads. So we're currently at around about 1.5 degrees, let's say. I don't think you would look out the window for climate reasons, but I mean, if it's at 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, maybe that picture will be different. So it depends a lot on where we head.
How would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so would call myself a senior researcher or research professor, as we use in English. Climate research in Oslo, so a pretty multidisciplinary research institute across the spectrum of climate issues. And I work primarily on emissions, emission trends, and it's actually maths and physics. So I come from a very numbers orientated direction.
Yeah. All right. So today outside it's around 20. How do you define climate versus the weather on a daily basis?
Yeah, so there's a nice expression for that. Weather is what you get. So of course, you have hot days, cold days throughout the year, but the climate is the central tendency, the average temperature in Oslo, and climate would cause that average to change. So you'll still have the ups and downs. One of the best graphs. So if you think you're walking a dog on a leash and you're going from A to B in a straight line, that is like the climate, whereas the dog's running backwards and forwards and around, dog is the weather.
Nice metaphor. Yeah. So we guys, which parts of the globe are most heavily affected now by climate change?
Yeah, so there's the impact. Let's say land areas are warming faster, northern areas warming faster. There's those sort of general characteristics, but you also need to map it somewhat to vulnerability. Um, And so a flood hitting Norway compared to a flood hitting a country that has less infrastructure and so on, the differences will be big. So broadly speaking, I'd say the biggest vulnerability is going to be in developing countries, those that are already at the margin, those are already that maybe at temperature, let's say. So if it's, I'm from Australia, so if it's 40 degrees in Australia and it becomes 42 degrees and then becomes 43 and then 44 as your sort of maximum temperature, then it becomes increasingly problematic. Whereas if you're in Norway and it's 20 degrees and it goes to 22 or 23, it's a different perception. So I think you go to the vulnerable parts first, those with let's say, the weakest infrastructure and so on. There's also natural systems which we need to think about. So things like Great Barrier Reef or Arctic sea ice or those sorts of things, they will, be heavily impacted. Um, and there's, let's say, social values to those. People like going to the Barrier Reef and so on. But there's also spin-off effects, indirect effects, let's say, potentially on fish stocks, food supply, and so on. So it starts to get very complex.
Yeah.
But I guess it's sort of very broad, but the vulnerable will feel the consequences first.
How sure are we that the change happening now is caused by us?
100%.
100%.
You can get into all sorts of 99 point whatever, but I mean, broadly speaking, it's 100%. The very little
Why?
disagreement. Multiple lines of evidence, lack of some alternative explanations. Uh, the whole detection and attribution field starts to get a little bit out of my area of expertise in terms of the details. But we have multiple lines of evidence, completely independent lines of evidence, which all point to the human signal. And yeah, there's virtually uh, there's basically no alternative explanation for what we see. So if someone can come up with an alternative that meets all the independent lines of evidence, then great. They'll get themselves a Nobel Prize in physics or something like that. But yeah, virtually, I think the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think used the words virtually certain. So yeah.
So, where do we stand today with regards to emission trajectories?
Yeah, so emissions, if you think about in the recent past, they may be taking a few, a decadal perspective. Emissions have been growing pretty strongly, a few percent per year on average, sort of more or less in line with economic activity. Um, there's little ups and downs. There's an oil crisis and things drop down and then they come back up again. So that's the general background picture. Then in the 2000s, we had this period where China joined the World Trade Organization. They had huge export, booming industries, a big investment in infrastructure and so on. And Chinese emissions grew very rapidly during the 2000s. And as a consequence, global emissions grew a bit faster, around about 3% per year, compared to that, let's say, 2% per year sort of average I mentioned. And then in the last, let's say in the 2010s, emissions growth, fossil fuel emissions growth at least, sort of leveled out somewhat. Still growing around about 1% per year, but it's a sort of, in comparison to the rapid growth in the 2000s, it's slowed down. And the sort of expectation, the current understanding is we're probably getting close to a peak in emissions. I think it's too early to say that we're there yet. And every time we think we're there, something happens, like there's a war or there's a pandemic, or so there's always something that pops up.
What kind of effect did the pandemic have on emissions? Rapid decline?
Yeah, rapid decline and a rapid rebound. So you could think you turn the tap off, 5%, and then a year later turn the tap back on. So that's generally how most crises, global financial crisis in 2008-9, same, oil crisis, pretty much the same. The tap's turned off or turned down a little bit for a while and then back on, which tells us we don't solve the problem by turning the tap off. We have to solve it in other ways. But emissions growth is slowing down. We are getting periods or years where solar, for example, covers most of the increase in electricity demand in particular. Depends a little bit on how strong electricity demand has grown, whether you need a little bit of coal, but we're getting to this situation where coal is just keeping its head above water, so to say. And we would expect coal use to sort of start to peak and trend down. And with that, global emissions will start to flatten out more confidently, let's say, and then hopefully start to trend down. So we're at that, we're near the top of the mountain. And an analogy I use sometimes in very appropriate for Norwegians. You're climbing up the mountain and you see that there's the top, and then you get to the top. No, it was a false top. The top's a little bit further, and then you go, oh, it's a little bit. So we're maybe at the false top, but we know we're getting close to the real top.
What are the climate targets, and given the political and economic realities, how likely are we to reach them?
Yeah, so this is something you would take a little bit country by country. Globally, there's no let's say concrete, easily quantifiable targets. Globally, it's well below 2 degrees. Try to
Yeah.
get to 1.5 degrees. That very sort of what does that actually mean? That's
Why,
translated by.
why do we know that 1.5 is so critical?
I wouldn't myself at least characterize 1.5 as like a threshold that, 1.49, it's all okay. 1.51, it's Armageddon, to use that word. It's more of a transition. Uh, just to use another analogy, I have a colleague that uses analogy of boxes, and if you think you're climbing up the boxes, maybe if you fall off at 1 degree onto the ground, then you'll ouch, but you won't break any bones. And 1.5 degrees, you're at the situation where, oh, okay, if I fall now, maybe it'll hurt. Maybe I'll even break a bone. And if you get to 2 degrees, okay, I'll break a bone if I fall from here, that type of thing. So the higher you get up, the risk of something bad happening increases. Um, you do see in the literature, if you think about things like sea ice, the Great Barrier Reef, coral reefs more broadly. I'm a bit biased talking about the Great Barrier Reef, I should say, coral reefs more broadly. Like we know around that sort of 1.5 degree mark, maybe 1.2, maybe 1.8, that there's the risks really amplify. And then also for heat stress, it's going to depend a lot on the region, changes in precipitation and so on. There's different levels where these sorts of things are expected to become much more problematic and the Paris Agreement is not framed as a hard limit, well below, like the goal is well below 2 degrees. What does that mean? And then, the pursue efforts for 1.5 degrees, the wording is the wording. Um, so in my reading of the English language, it's trying to get as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. It's not saying 1.5 and die type language. And I think that makes it a little bit hard in some senses. Like how do you formulate that into a target, like a concrete target, when the global target is not that concrete? But through the Paris Agreement, there is this process of countries every 5 years putting in a pledge on what they'll do, and then a process to follow up to make sure that they meet that pledge. And over time, these pledges or targets are meant to get stronger and stronger. Um, so if you think of Europe, geez, I can't even remember the exact numbers now. But it has a series of reduction targets through the 2030s, 2040s, and then net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. 2020 targets, Europe exceeded, did better than they should have by exceed. Let's say Europe has been on progress, for example. But when you start to stretch out to 2040 or 2050 and you're getting closer and closer to zero, it's going to get harder and harder. That's just taking Europe as an example. If you pick some other countries, China or India, China has these emission intensity targets. So how much carbon is emitted per unit of economic activity. These are, you can have a target which sounds quite aggressive, but it has increasing emissions because emission intensity generally declines over time. So you can, like, economies get more efficient, basically. So those targets can be a little bit like business as usual. And China has this also to peak emissions by 2030. So you could say China is sort of on track to meet its targets, but then you can question how ambitious are those targets. India also has these intensity targets. You could say not overly ambitious. Some studies, quite a few studies actually show that these targets are close to business as usual. So you sort of have to try and understand, is this target an aggressive target, like the country has to really do some heavy lifting, or is this a target where you just sort of keep following your nose and you will get there anyway? Um, Maybe I'll add to something else to that as well, this developed and developing country differentiation. So if you go to the US and Europe as an example, they have old coal power fleets. So power stations were shutting down anyway. You know, the coal power plant was 50 years. Maybe it could go for another 2 years, but we're going to shut it anyway. And so you have this sort of structural feature in the EU and the US in particular, where you expect emissions to start to trend down unless you don't replace coal with coal. Unless you replace coal with coal. So if you're growing renewables and that's displacing coal, then emissions you would expect to trend down. So what would have we expected European emissions to do in the absence of climate policy compared to what is the additional effect of climate policy is quite a hard question to answer. Then when you come to developing countries, it's the same sort of issue, but their economies are growing, energy consumption is growing, they have young coal power fleets. So what would have Chinese or Indian emissions looked like in the absence of any climate policy or any technological progress? These are very hard questions to answer. So it's quite hard to figure out how much effort is Europe putting in comparison to China, in comparison to Mozambique, in comparison to Peru and whatever. This is getting to the sort of cutting edge of science in a sense, trying to understand the effects of policy and technology on emissions.
But would you say we are on the right track
No.
globally?
Well,
No.
it depends what you would like your track to be. So, what's the right track? So, if you define what the right track is being broadly consistent with Paris, so well below 2 degrees, no, we're not on track. I would really need emissions to be trending down, see some structural decline in countries. Maybe some people are a little bit more optimistic. But you could split the are we on track in several dimensions. Are we on track in terms, let's say, of peaking emissions globally? Yeah, getting close, but not there yet. And then maybe if you think about, are we able to get emissions down? We have the technologies there to start emissions going down at a decent rate, I think, in the short term. It's just a matter of deployment and retiring the old infrastructure, if you like. And then there's this phase around net zero, which is then another question that sort of, have you decarbonized aviation? Have you decarbonized international shipping? How do you produce steel? So these hard to sort of address sectors, then that's another question. Can we deal with those?
What are the main sectors that produce the most carbon?
Yeah, so the power sector, so electricity generation, will be up there. Well, it is the biggest,
And that's
but it's
mostly
also
because of coal.
yes, and
Yeah.
it's also the easiest to transition, I'd say. So that's some good news, bad news there. Industry, um, and transport will be the next two biggest. There's a little bit of how you allocate things between the different sectors as well, but just put that aside. For industry uses electricity, for example, so do you allocate that to electricity or to industry? But if you think about process emissions, things like cement and production of steel, um, and then transport as a aggregate, um, is very big, not as big as power, but it's big. But transport consists of road transport, aviation, shipping, and within the road segment, you've got trucks, personal cars, and so on. So when you disaggregate those elements, they become a little bit smaller each. And we have good technologies for some. So in the personal transportation, so cars, then we have, electric cars work and do well. Whereas in let's say aviation, it's more difficult, or shipping is more difficult, particularly long
With
distance.
regards to electric cars, isn't like the if you look at the whole life cycle, isn't it just as much emissions when you think about the battery, etc. The whole process with an electric car compared to a combustion, isn't it more or less the same?
No, cars, there's a time effect. So, to the initial building of the car is more emission intensive, but then you gain back, and how quick you gain back will depend on factors like the electricity system. But the thing with electric cars, and one thing that makes them so effective, is it's basically a superior technology. So it's far more efficient. Than an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engine basically works on heat. It's hot, and you waste most of it into the air. Electric car, it's more direct. Um, so I think the efficiency difference, I think internal combustions are around about 10% efficient at turning the energy in the petrol into propulsion, whereas electric cars, I think, are around about 80 to 90%. So very different technologically. Then how do you produce the electricity? So in China, for example, it's going to be a much bigger bias towards coal. In Norway, it's very big bias towards hydropower. But even if you have a coal generation system, electric cars often over time turn out better just because of the efficiency gain. Coal's not that efficient either. Um, you lose, basically two-thirds of the heat goes to the air, basically. Um, but even so, the gains that you get in the propulsion system of electric car, so it'll take longer to get the positive gains in a China than in a Norway, but they win out. And we
Yeah.
also know the energy systems are transitioning. Coal is becoming a smaller element of electricity generation in pretty much every country. So it's going to get better and better over time. Um, I think this is also an interesting. This relates to several technologies, not just electric vehicles. But if you take cars as an example, internal combustion engine, there's let's say at least 100 years of experience in refining that technology, and it's sort of maxed out. You don't get much gain from year to year by tweaking your internal combustion engine. Whereas electric cars and battery technology, they've had 20 years, let's say, of experience. And when you jump ahead 80 years and when we're at the situation where you've maxed out all the efficiency improvements in electric vehicles and batteries, I mean, they'll be just miles ahead in terms of their performance relative to internal combustion engines,
Yeah.
I would think.
So you spoke about the power sector. What would happen if overnight you switched from coal, etc., to nuclear? How much of a drop in percentage would we see in emissions?
Um, if you, this would be just pulling off the top of my head, uh, 20, 30%, something like that.
Okay.
There's, a little bit around the edges, exactly. Coal is about 30%. Not all coal is used for electricity, but then there's also some gas used for electricity. So, but if you did that, yes, there would be a bit of a hit. All these, it's like the electric car argument that you sort of mentioned. Like when nuclear power plants are pretty material intensive, so they have a lot of cement and steel. So you get a spike through construction that you then need to, pay back over time. So, even if you just put that aside, um, yeah.
I see. And how do you see the difference between what's technologically possible versus what's realistically achievable?
Yeah, so technologically, um, So realistically, if you think about it in terms of politics and public opinion, public acceptance, and so on, I think there's going to be quite a gap. And how big that gap is, it's hard to quantify, which which is something I find very frustrating for quite a few reasons, because many of these things you would expect people to be somewhat agnostic, but they're not. So people want electricity, right? So, they plug in their whatever and it works. And they should be agnostic to how it's produced. And many electrically based systems are far more efficient. Renewables and wind have some distinct advantages over things like coal and nuclear. It should, in principle, be cheaper and so on. It's a bit like electric vehicles. They have superior elements compared to internal combustion engines. So people should, you would think, in a rational sense, would like these technologies, just like, oh, new technology, this I can do this better, my TV's better, my phone's better. People love technological progress broadly, but they hate it when it comes to climate. So there's been this political element that's been put in there, which has politicized the whole debate. So yeah, so I think Norway's a bit of an exception with the electric vehicles, but if you go to countries like Australia or US, these sort of, I guess, fossil heavy countries, like they're going to be the ones that'll miss out. It's the average person in those countries that will miss out on the technological advances, because there's some political ideology against technological progress, in relation to climates. So if these sorts of issues were less politicized, I think people would be far more embracing of technological change in the climate domain.
You see it as realistic when you think about the capitalistic system requiring growth. Or would we have to, like, we live in a welfare state here in Norway? Is it a requirement that we have less if it's going to get better? Do the average person need to have less of a welfare system?
No, I wouldn't think so. There's a couple of elements to that. So on the capitalistic direction, uh, climate is a huge investment opportunity. So if you're, more in the capitalistic flavor of the world, and like to make money, then climate should be, well, cool. Here's an opportunity, a new opportunity, new technology, and so on. So there's this sort of tension, I guess, between existing industry and existing capital and new industry and new capital. So who will be the billionaires of the future? Will they be solar capitalists? Will they be electric vehicle like Elon Musk type? So that's one element. But I think there's a general fallacy about cost, which I think is sort of unfairly discussed in, let's say, political media, social debate. So assumption that anything related to climate costs. But let's say if we think about a car, it's not as if you buy an electric car. The alternatives are not no car, electric car. So therefore you're forced to buy an electric car. It's like, do you buy car A or car B? Okay. Do you want car A expensive or car B cheap? And car B, which is electric car, is generally, particularly over the lifetime cost, cheaper, and will get more so. So in that sense, the average person in the street will have more money in their pockets. And likewise with renewables, particularly in certain regions and countries, it is just cheaper, it's faster, it's more flexible. as many advantages, so you will have more money in your pocket. So this sort of narrative that climate mitigation means you need to go live in a cave, I think is rather untrue.
Yeah. But just to stay on that, what about the retail industry and that every person, like you said, we want a new iPhone, etc., a better one. It's just marginally better. Why do we always need to have more and more? Why do I need like 10 different sets of clothes, etc.?
Yeah.
And is this possible when we just consume more and more and more and produce more and more and more?
Yep.
I
No,
don't need 10 different
this.
shoes.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you. So there's this is a huge issue, and this boosts growth. So there's a sort of a, I don't know, bipartisan acceptance that we just do this, because oh, more money, more jobs, more retail, more, as you say. And it would help on the mitigation side. It would help on many problems with society actually to tone this down somewhat. So it's not just related to climate, but all sorts of pollution, probably worker rights, just general consumer rights, etc. Everything is just pushing the consumption element. So backing off that, I would support for a whole multitude of reasons, and one element of that is climate. I think one, just to take the climate element, yeah, I could say so many things on this topic, but just let's take the climate element and just aggregated consumption. Um, if you spend less on buying junk, let's say, if you keep your iPhone and don't buy a new one for an extra couple of years, then what do you do with that money that you have? Um, so there's these sorts of rebound effects that, well, okay, I've saved money because now my clothes last 10 years instead of 10 days, and I keep my iPhone and my computer for a decade instead of 2 years or whatever. Now I'm going to fly to southern Spain and have a nice holiday, then that would offset all the gains. So there is a bigger picture on consumption per se. So saving in one area could lead to increasing in another area. So it's a little bit, how do you balance these issues out? So these are real, I think these get into really big questions of the setup of a country, the taxation system, the whole yeah, health sector, education sector, what's the relationship between these things, a welfare state, whatever. All these things come in and relate to this issue of consumption, I think. So yeah, these are huge issues though, but also relevant for climate.
And there's also the insanity with like the built-in sort of kill switch in computers, phones that they're supposed to crash after X amount of years, and then you have to buy a new one.
Yep. I
They,
spent half
like,
my day complaining about things like this.
and it's just acceptable, and it's more expensive to fix it than to buy a new one. So we did it ourselves.
Yeah. I think this is a huge issue, and society's just come to accept it. Like, I don't know, sort of the degree to which you have alternatives. So clothes are a good example. Like you wear a t-shirt a few times and then you're taking it off, and your hand goes through it. It just rips. It's like, come on. Um, so then if you go and try find an alternative that was, made like it should be made,
Mhm.
then you either A, can't find it, or it costs a fortune. There seems to be no sort of middle ground. But this applies across so many elements. Pretty much everything you buy these days has the same issue, um, the same vulnerabilities. It's so hard to get things fixed. I've been trying this with zippers, for example. Every clothing item I have that has a zipper, the zipper breaks first, and then yeah, cheaper to go buy a new whatever than it is to get the zipper fixed. So these sorts of there's fundamental issues I think that need to be sorted out, but it's the I guess the disappointing part is there's not a an organized structure that pushes back on this and ensures that companies or whatever have some obligations related to this. But anyway, I guess this is getting a bit off climate, but it all relates back, I think, to regulation and what we think about policies that we implement. So companies need some sort of regulation, because if they're not regulated, they just go and do crazy things. So we end up with, we need to have a consumer rights laws, we need to and we can't trust companies just to reduce their emissions because, oh, we'll just reduce our emissions. They need to have policy to reduce their emissions because they won't do it otherwise. So, but this applies across the board with almost any issue in life, I think.
Yeah. So, with regards to climate change and what's irreversible, how do you see the balance between coping and reversing? Both, I'm thinking then in the more long term with trends that we can't reverse, I guess.
Yeah. So climate's essentially a cumulative problem. It depends on cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. So this pretty much means that the emissions that have happened already and the impacts that we get, we're stuck with forever.
Yeah.
So the temperature's gone up, let's say 1.5 degrees today, roughly. If we stopped all emissions overnight, world stopped and no more emissions, we're still stuck with 1.5 degrees. That doesn't go away. So this is the first real big challenge with climate, because it's cumulative. The more you delay, the longer you wait, the worse it gets, and you more or less can't reverse it. I'll come back to the reversing bit. So the first thing is to stop making it worse. Uh, so some colleagues use there's the fundamental law of holes. Rule number one, stop digging. So we need to stop digging the hole deeper, and that's to get emissions down towards zero as fast as possible. And let's say we succeed moderately, and emissions and temperatures, in 50 years' time are around 2.5 degrees, let's say. Just for argument's sake, let's just say 2.5 degrees. And then we decide, okay, this sucks. These impacts are too much. Can we get the temperature back down? And then this gets into situations of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So rewinding the clock, more or less, by sucking carbon back out of the air, which is expensive and it's hard. Although trees do it. So in that sense, it's cheap and easy. But we're limited by land area, and trees are vulnerable to climate impacts. But there's also machines which can suck carbon out of the air, much more expensive. And if you suck enough carbon out, we're talking multiple, hundreds of billions of tons over decades, then you could get the temperature down from, let's say, 2 degrees to, this is an extreme example. Let's say you go, sorry, I was using 2.5 degrees to 2 degrees. And let's say, okay, the climate impacts at 2 degrees we can handle, and we'll just stay around zero emissions. But there's some climate impacts which will be irreversible, essentially, certainly on human timescales. So sea level rise, it's a very slow process. It's like melting ice, if you think about that. And it's very hard to refreeze it once you've let it go out. And it keeps going out for hundreds of years, it keeps melting and rising for hundreds of years. So effects like sea level rise will be essentially irreversible. Things like damages to coral reefs, for example, irreversible. Temperature extremes may back off. Precipitation patterns, very uncertain how they change over time, particularly as you go back down. But we'll be stuck with some impacts. You can reverse some other impacts, but it comes at a cost. It's not cheap. It's not easy. It's better not to cause the problem in the first place.
How big is the potential lag in the system if we stop before things start to reverse back?
Um, so yeah, a couple of different ways to answer that question. So at a fundamental point, the relationship between CO2 and temperature is, let's say, good enough as 1 to 1. So you can think immediate. So if we immediately stopped emitting today, then the temperature would stabilize pretty quickly, like within a few years, let's say. There are big nuances because we also emit methane and sulfur dioxide and all these other things which affect climate. So if you go to zero, you have to consider the effect of these other components as well. But let's say first order, let's say that there's a 1 to 1 effect. But then if you want to go from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, we're talking about carbon dioxide removal in the order of 100 billion tons of CO2. You can't do that overnight. So that would take many decades to get to that scale of carbon dioxide removal. So in that sense, to go from 2.5 degrees to 2 degrees, that would happen over, let's say, 1 or 2 generations. So if we were
Generations
living,
around 30 years.
yeah, even longer, I'd say, yeah, we're talking 50 years or whatever. So if it was us living in the 2.5 degree world, it'd be our kids and maybe even grandkids that would benefit the 2 degree world. This is another problem with the climate, another big problem with climate. So if you think today we're living in the 1.5 degree world, it'll be our kids and our grandkids. They're the ones that get the 2 and 2.5 degree world. We don't get it. Yeah.
So it's not immediate enough to do radical change.
Yeah.
In
It's
other
not as if
words,
you're putting your hand on the hot plate and it sizzles immediately and you remove it immediately. Or yeah.
what about the strong natural cycles like the Milankovitch cycle and ice ages? Is the natural cycle so strong that over time we will eventually return to an ice age no matter what we emit?
Yeah. So if you're thinking back in the past first, there's these cycles, the Earth going around the sun, the orbit changes, the tilt changes, and these are relatively well understood. The sun also has these 11-year cycles, sunspot cycles, and over hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years, these cycles kick in, and the world will, let's say, relative to baseline, get warmer and colder, go in and out of ice ages. So that cycle will continue. I mean, these cycles they're not going to change. um, but I don't know actually how those cycles, the implications of those cycles change when the background concentration is a lot higher. So if we've emitted a lot of CO2, temperatures, let's say 2 degrees warmer than what it would have been otherwise, and then we come into an ice age, I or otherwise, yeah, that I don't know what the literature says about that, but of course, there's less incoming solar radiation. Sorry, there's less reflection and so on. So, no, sorry, I'm getting myself confused now. With these cycles, there will be more or less incoming solar radiation because of where the sun is relative to the Earth and so on, and the way it's tilted. So they will affect the climate as they have in the past, whether it's enough to offset our human emissions. Probably not, somewhat at the margins, I would think, yes. But I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years into the future. So sort of one thing that I sort of, the Earth will be the planet will exist, but what state it's in. So I don't think we get into these runaway feedbacks and the Earth will explode, or just turn into an ice ball again. The system will respond, but it's a question of what time scale does that system respond. So if there's a change in if the world goes from 0 degree temperature change to 1 degree temperature change over 1,000 years, that's very different to doing it over 20 years. So the time scale plays an important role. And with these Milankovitch cycles, they play out over tens, hundreds of thousands of years. So the vegetation, the system is responding to these changes as they come in. It's not as if it's suddenly the orbit changes and suddenly it gets hotter. It's a very slow, long process. Whereas with a human, in an extremely small time scale, we've just increased the concentration and the temperature, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature.
So if you were a politician, what would be the main bullet points that you would implement as fast as possible?
Oh, yeah. Well, now I'm. So the end point, if you think about the end point is to not be burning fossil fuels, pretty much. And if you're burning fossil fuels, they have to have carbon capture and storage. So it's a case of going through sector by sector and what policies work for the different sectors, and how do you transition those policies over time. Maybe in a more practical sense, I think one mistake politicians make time and time again is they're not very good at communicating the background state, if you like. So just to use some examples, very Norwegian specific, but Norges pris, the Norway price for electricity, you could say, that's a response to public pressure, but you could say the government has failed of both sides of politics over 10, 20, 30 years to explain, make people understand why we have the electricity system we have, why it works the way it does, etc. So then people would maybe at least be more open to seeing the advantages and disadvantages of something like Norges pris, or the implications of cables to different countries and so on. So I think there's a general failure of politicians to explain the reason for things. I think a big one is immigration, where we find a lot of the problems that we have today, I think, have been politicians over generations have been poor at explaining the role that immigration plays in an economy and so on. So I think with climate, there also needs to be this discussion about trade-offs that needs to happen over decades. So that's a little bit slow, but for people to understand, why wind turbines in Norway aren't such a bad thing, and that we've got industrial parks as well. There's some nature impacts on nature by almost all the decisions we make. So it's a little bit about understanding the pros and cons, because there's a lot of public resistance to anything related to climate. So, oh no, the wind turbines, we can't have those wind turbines. But having the big shopping centre across the road where they had to bulldoze the forest, that's fine. They just that people aren't making these connections between the impacts of society on nature specifically, and more broadly things like climate and so on. So I think it's very important to keep open a dialogue of why things are happening, which is not going to solve many problems, but I think that makes it easier over time to implement policies that would be more acceptable to people. I guess transition away from oil and gas in Norway. There's going to be a transition away from oil and gas in Norway anyway, irrespective of climate, because The resource is just not infinite. The scenarios of oil and gas production in Norway, irrespective of climate, are all downwards. So Norway has to transition away from oil and gas anyway. So you have to have this discussion irrespective of climate. And no one wants to have that discussion. And I think these sorts of things are problematic. And so when you put the climate dimension on top of it, it becomes even more problematic than it should otherwise be. So we need to have a discussion, Norway, for example, how to transition away from oil and gas. So, Norwegians have meaningful employment in the years ahead in whatever industries that would be. You need to start that process because that process takes potentially decades. You can't just click your finger and suddenly Norway's an expert in some other technology. So, and this applies for most countries. Big problem in Australia, where I'm from as well. Same problem. Politicians are unwilling to address these big challenges that will have huge effects in decades ahead. I'm not sure that's a very unspecific answer to your question.
What kind of responsibility do you place on the average person?
In practice, the average person, if you speaking on behalf of all average people, they have kids and family and jobs and whatever. So it's not up to them to solve the climate problem per se. They don't have the levers. They have some levers, but they don't have the biggest levers. They have little joysticks that they can play with, but it's the government and industry that has the big levers that can change things. So I think maybe for them, it's a little bit more about being informed, knowing what the solutions are, knowing what way they should vote, knowing what good decisions and bad decisions at the societal point of view, not thinking so much individual, but thinking more society as a whole. So understanding the problem, understanding, sort of the broad scope of solutions, given they have some small levers that they can make some personal choices which would help. But ultimately, they're going to have to help push the government and industry to pull the big levers in the right direction.
Is there anything we have not addressed that we should?
Yeah, you've pushed me into the very difficult questions, which none of us are expert on, but we all have opinion on. I think, if you think of climate solutions as technological progress, and life will be better because we're getting better technologies. The car will be better, the transport will be better. Hopefully the devices we buy will be better. The electricity will be cheaper, hopefully. Then I think maybe we would end in a good place. We're not going to return to caves. That's not at all what this is about.
Last question then. What is the meaning of life?
To be happy.
All right. Glen Peters, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you very much. It was enjoyable. Thank you.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.